The tight end landscape finally feels like it's starting to settle. There's a few steady names up top and a couple of new faces sneaking into the mix and plenty of matchup volatility to navigate. So let's break down the top 15 tight ends that you can trust heading into week 8. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King. And before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings between Jake and Kyle. And for more detailed analysis, make sure to check out the start-sit videos from Kyle already posted on the channel this week. And if you want even more breakdowns each week, join the Fantasy Headliners community by tapping that join button below. That's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and an exclusive spot inside of our Discord. Now, before we dive into week 8, we've got a few hits and misses that we've got to cover from last week. Our first hit was Zach Ertz, and he bounced back after some inconsistent play, and he finished top 12 just like we had him ranked. Our next hit was Cade Otton, and we expected a bigger role with all of the injuries, and we ranked him higher because of it, and he ended with 10 fantasy points, and everyone who started him benefited from it. Up next is Michael Mayer, and he had a ton of hype surrounding him in week 7 with Bowers and Myers out, but we just didn't trust the guy. We kept him out of the top 15, and he didn't do anything in week 7. All right, so that's it for our hits. Let's look at our misses, and we start with George Kittle. 2 targets for 0 catches is not something that you see often with one of the best tight ends in football. He himself said to blame Kyle Shanahan, so let's do just that. Next up is Dallas Goedert, and unfortunately when Hurts is going deep to AJ and Devontae, it tends to leave Goddard on the outside looking in like the last kid to be chosen in the schoolyard game of dodgeball. Next up is Harold Fannin Jr., and between Cleveland blowing out Miami and the weather, they just didn't need Fannin much. Hopefully he gets another chance in week 8. All right, that's it for our hits and misses. Let's turn the page to week 8. In tier 1, we have Tucker Kraft, Jake Ferguson, Tyler Warren, and Dallas Goedert. And number 1, we've got Tucker Kraft, and he's the most consistent weapon in the Green Bay passing game. He scored 10 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games, and now he gets a matchup against Pittsburgh, who allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to tight ends. And number 2, we've got Fergie Ferg, Jake Ferguson, and CeeDee Lamb returns, and Ferguson still scored over 10 fantasy points. He now has 6 touchdowns over his last 4 games, and if Surtain is locking down Pickens or Lamb, that could only help out Fergie. At number 3, we have Tyler Warren, and he's had 10 plus fantasy points in 4 straight. He's got touchdowns in 3 straight. Now, word of caution here, the Titans are easier to run on because when they played each other in week 3, they held Warren to 3 catches for 38 yards, and that was his worst game of the year. But if you have him, you gotta start him. At number 4, we've got Dallas Goedert, and Goedert's best game of the season was 2 weeks ago against this Giants defense. Week 7 was a down week, but Philly doesn't want to lose both matchups against the Giants, so don't be surprised if we see a lot of Dallas Goedert again. All right, before we head into the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all hooked up on Underdog. You already know that we're crushing those player pick'ems on Underdog this year, so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app. Create a new account using the referral code HEADLINERS when you do so, and then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. If you sign up with that promo code, again, it's HEADLINERS, you're going to get access to all of the promos that Underdog offers weekly. And check this out. Once you play your first $5, they're going to give you a $100 bonus in bonus funds. And so play 5, get 100. It's that easy. And don't forget, Jake is going to be breaking down the best picks weekly in our show on Fridays. So the links to join are in the description, and we look forward to playing with you this week. All right, let's look at tier 2. We have George Kittle, Dalton Kincaid, Mason Taylor, Cade Otton, Dalton Schultz, and Harold Fannin Jr. At number 5, we have George Kittle, and Kittle told us to blame Kyle Shanahan for his lack of targets in week 7, which is great. I mean, it's always nice to have somebody to blame, but you have to think that he ramps up more each week. But this is a sneaky tough matchup against Houston, so be careful with this week. At number 6, we have Dalton Kincaid, and he's currently questionable to play, but when he's healthy, he's been one of the best tight ends in football. He's a top 10 tight end on the season, and he's missed a game and had his bye, if that tells you anything. At number 7, we've got Mason Taylor, and the change to Tyrod Taylor is a benefit here. Fields just couldn't figure out how to move the ball through the air, and this week Mason Taylor gets a matchup going up against Cincy, who allows the most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. At number 8, we have Cade Otton, and we really hate to see Mike Evans go down for the season, but one thing is for sure, that injury will mean increased targets to Cade Otton in the foreseeable future. The Saints also allow over 11 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. At number 9, we've got Dalton Schultz, and with Nico Collins currently in the watermelon protocol, Dalton Schultz could be the most targeted pass catcher in Houston this week. And with Stroud not able to figure out the deep ball, Schultz could have a fairly safe floor in week 8. At number 10, we've got Harold Fannin Jr. going into New England, and between the weather not being great and the Browns destroying the Dolphins, Fannin just wasn't needed much in week 7. Now here in week 8, he faces the Pats, who are easier to throw on than run on, and Njoku is questionable to play as well. Okay, so that's it for tier 2. Let's look at tier 3. We've got Aronde Gadsden, Travis Swift-Kelsey, Kyle Pitts, Zach Ertz, and Mark Andrews. Let's look at Aronde Gadsden, and 8 targets in back-to-back games is great, but obviously we can't expect 150 yards a week in an offense filled with multiple weapons. This week he gets the Vikings, who allow just under 10 fantasy points per game to tight ends. At number 12, we've got Travis Swift-Kelsey, and with Rice back in a healthy Hollywood and Worthy, Kelsey isn't going to be overly needed each week. He'll have the occasional touchdown, giving him a good game, but for the most part, he's a long way from that autumn night of yesteryear. He'll be a Verge top 12 tight end for the rest of the season. At number 13, we've got Kyle Pitts, and it's unclear whether or not the foot injury to Michael Penix is going to limit him or not in week 8. Pitts hasn't shown the highest ceiling, but this is a great matchup going against Miami, who allows over 11 fantasy points per game to tight ends. At number 14, we have Zach Ertz going into KC, and the QB carousel once again here in Washington. And as of right now, we don't even know if they're going to have Debo or Terry back in week 8. It's going to be hard to run on KC, so they're going to have to throw it to somebody. So we're hoping for Ertz here at 14. At number 15, we've got Mark Andrews, and a lot of this hinges on the availability of Lamar Jackson. If he sits, we're dropping down Andrews and we're putting Jonnu Smith here. But if Lamar plays, this is going to be a great matchup against Chicago, who allows over 11 fantasy points per game to tight ends. All right, so that's your top 15 tight ends in tiers 1, 2, and 3. And we got a couple guys on the outside looking in Hunter Henry, Evan Ingram, TJ Hawkinson, Theo Johnson, Jawan Johnson, Noah Fant, and Jonnu Smith. And that's your week 8 tight end rankings. Some familiar faces, a few surprises, and hopefully your next fantasy win in the mix. Make sure to drop your tight end start in the comments. Hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe, and let's lock in for another big week. Let's go.
Analytics off the chain, all the channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headline Nation, we running the game.